Adequacy, moderated by LA Times energy reporter Sammy Roth.
All right, I think I'm on here. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. I'm very excited about this panel. The topic that we're discussing, moving California to 100% renewable energy while maintaining reliability and adequacy of our power system. It's a especially important topic, I think, right at this moment. We have just faced these wildfire crises that are ongoing. We have these heat waves that are challenging the power system and making it difficult to keep the lights on at times. These are challenges that are both exacerbated by climate change and also challenges that speak to the importance of cleaning up the grid and moving to 100% clean power. It's also an interesting moment because California has this goal of 100% climate-friendly electricity by 2045, but there's discussion that's ongoing right now. Governor Newsom last week commented that he thinks 2045 is not soon enough, which is really interesting because until quite recently that was seen as a very ambitious goal, and now the conversation seems to be moving past that. So really excited to talk about all of these issues. We have a great set of panelists here, and I'd love to just ask them each to introduce themselves, and then I'll have some questions. So maybe in the order we've got here, if our panelists wouldn't mind just briefly saying hello.
Hi, I'm Marty Adams. I'm the General Manager and Chief Engineer at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power.
Tom, are you there?
I am. Good evening. I'm Tom Buttgenbach, founder and CEO of 8 Minutes Solar Energy.
All right, and I think Mike is here somewhere. I'm still looking to see how I can see everybody. Is Mike in the room here? Do we have Mike? Not sure about Mike, but we've got Carla, of course, from Edison. Hey, Carla.
Hi, everyone. Carla Peterman, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Regulatory Affairs at Edison, Southern California Edison. And I wish I had a cool background like Tom.
Yeah, Tom's background is pretty good. And Commissioner Randolph, you have a background there. I think that's the PUC building, right?
That is, in fact, the PUC building at the corner of Van Ness and Golden Gate. So I am Liane Randolph. I'm the Commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission.
And I think Mike is on the call now too. Mike, are you there? Well, maybe Mike will be able to join us as we get started, as that gets worked out. I think the place that I want to start is this question about 2045 and when do we really need to have our grid totally cleaned up? As I said, there's discussion from the governor now that 2045 is waiting too long. Joe Biden has a climate plan that has a 2035 date in it for meeting that target. Just to start by, I guess, putting you all on the spot on a very difficult question, very interested what you would say is the, when should we be targeting as a state 100% clean energy? What is a date that is both feasible and also up to the challenge we face if 2045 is too long to wait? What do you all think? Whoever wants to start with that one, it's a big one.
I can start. I'll just say, from the perspective of a regulator implementing state law, we are have a very clear mandate to move to 100% by 2045. So that is what our planning is about. And in terms of whether or not to go faster or slower, I think the reality is that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of steel in the ground. And we need to be pushing those projects, moving the procurement, working toward those goals, full speed ahead, regardless of whether we're talking 2035, 2045. I will also say that this is really an economy-wide question, and the next scoping plan that that CARB will adopt will be informative, because we really need to be thinking about meeting our climate goals in terms of the entire economy and powering our transportation sector. And if we're going to meet our climate goals. We're going to need an electrified transportation system. So we need to build a grid that meets that additional demand. And that may cause us to, go closer to 2045 than sooner. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
I'm going to want to follow up on the steel in the ground and also the what are we asking of the power sector questions, but I'll let some other folks on the panel weigh in first.
Sammy, mic's on if you can hear me.
Yes, I can, Mike. Do you want to tackle this one?
I'm sure I'd be happy to. I'm Mike Garland. I'm CEO and founder of Pattern Energy Group, one of the largest private renewable companies. We do wind, solar, storage, transmission in North America and in Japan. Steel in the ground is our game. We love it. I think it's really a matter of government will and leadership. And I think LADWP certainly in LA is showing that type of leadership. But when you look at the components that are needed to get steel in the ground at the level that you're talking about, 100% clean by 45, the costs are down there. Cost for renewables is cheap or very inexpensive, 2 cents to 4 or 5 cents, and that's some of the lowest cost in our history. There's universal support. The technology is available for 100%, both in the type of renewable equipment needed as well as grid improvements. And obviously the evidence for the need to move quickly is here with the fires and the storms in the Southeast. And to me, I think you'll probably get into this, but I think the critical next step is to talk about the need for a robust grid, a grid that can accommodate that level of growth into integration. And that's a huge effort on the part of the utilities to be able to, and grid integrators to be able to get this level of penetration of renewables into the system. But the technology there, I think companies like Tom's and ours are ready to do and accelerate our development activities. I know that to meet that level, we'll need about 150,000 megawatts of new wind and solar coming into the California system. And I think the industry is ready to gear up for it, particularly depending on the politics that come about and the will of government to make it happen.
So we have one vote so far for 2045 is pretty ambitious. One vote for it's a question of government will. Who else wants to weigh in?
I'll say, first of all, if I can do I didn't do my disclaimer at the start of this panel, which is in my comments, I may touch upon some active CPUC proceedings, particularly the resource adequacy and integrated resource planning proceeding. And so if I do, given that we have a decision maker on the panel, I will follow up with the appropriate ex parte filings.
Thank you, Carla.
So with that being said, maybe I'll add another word to it. I think 2045 goals are necessary. I mean, this is all with the intention of managing climate change and staying under 2 degrees. And the electric sector has a critical role to play. And so I think the targets are appropriate for our sector. At SCE, we'd like to see certain milestones moved up. So we would advocate for more aggressive near-term targets in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. And that builds upon the last set of comments from Mike about the importance of getting procurement and steel in the ground. And so the sooner we can have more aggressive targets to work towards over the next few years, then that provides more opportunity and a little bit more runway for us to do the necessary procurement.
When you say moving up emissions targets, do you mean like the 40% reduction by 2030, moving that up, or what are you thinking about?
No, more in order to get to that 40% reduction by 2030, we've got to plan our procurement to get to a certain greenhouse gas reduction level. And so we advocate for a lower planning target in our PUC proceedings than we currently have. And so right now, the utilities are putting forward portfolios for procurement that reflect a couple different levels of greenhouse gas reductions. And we would say target the highest level of reductions, just to make sure that we're able to get all the procurement done in time for 2030. So maybe I'll have a hybrid answer, which is 2045 is necessary, 2030 is necessary, but it's aggressive. And so we'd like to get that procurement going.
Tom, it looked like you were gonna weigh in here.
Yeah, and I see Marty. By the way, I think you have the best title, Marty, Chief Engineer. I love that. It's going to take a lot of engineers to get us there. And I think, honestly, I think 2045 is comfortably doable. 35 is aggressive, but I think targets have to be aggressive, right? If you look at the last 10 years, what we've done in California, 10 years ago, people said, 20% RPS was undoable. The lights are going to flicker. 33%, we've surpassed that now. So I think we can do it. I mean, this is the most innovative state in the most innovative country in the world. And I think let's not forget about the technologies and the integration, battery energy storage systems, software, the grid of the next century. All of that is a huge opportunity. The technologies are there. We've got to figure out how to do it. It's not technology really that's holding us back. It's Marty will agree with that, transmission, right? We're going to have to, think about ways how to get this power in. Our system was built around fossil fuel plants, and it was not built around renewables. But there's, again, technological solutions that allow us to utilize existing transmission much more effectively. There's DC lines. There's a lot of work ahead, but can it be done in 10 or 15 years? I think, yes. Do we have to hit exactly 100? I think, as Carla was saying, this is overall decarbonization. It's not just, do I get the last 5% of the grid? But it is, do I have a really meaningful impact in terms of driving carbon down and really fighting climate change? And we need to look at it holistically. I think in terms of carbon reduction goals, I don't see any reason why we could not hit that in 10 to 15 years.
Hit what in 10 to 15 years?
Reducing the equivalent carbon to 100% clean grid.
I see. Marty, I'll add in quickly here before you answer the question. I'll just point out DWP is doing this comprehensive study right now, as I understand it, with NREL, trying to figure out, what does the mix in 2045 look like? And I think as part of that study, they've also been looking at a 2035 mix and how that would affect the cost and the timeline. So just pointing that out before you answer the question.
Yeah, so we've been working toward 2045, and there's a lot of things here you have to really kind of think about. I mean, first of all, is it 100% renewable or is it 100% carbon free, which are not the same things? And the other thing that you look at, I mean, as you try to edge toward 100% of anything, that when you get to 80%, you can do it. You get to 90%, getting tougher. That last 10% could be very difficult and can be very expensive. And one of the key things we have to look about is what's the affordability, because as you move faster, you're going to also have to look at the impacts on the folks that have to pay the rates for the power system. So everybody wants clean energy, wants a clean future. At the same time, we have to do it in a way that doesn't break the bank. As Tom mentioned, we have a lot of transmission to build and wires to connect areas because a lot of this renewable energy is not where the customers are. We're actually really reaching further outside of the metropolitan areas for energy. We've got to get that energy in. We've got to move it around the system correctly. And we have to be able to withstand things like wildfires that take out transmission lines and other things that cause outages. And the one thing I always think about is say 100%, is it 100% every second of every day or 100% when everything's running normally? Because that's a big difference. Because the biggest thing that we see as a challenge with renewables is how do you store energy? And we see it on a regular hot day as it is. We'll have more energy storage capability. We're working with Tom's company on Elan Solar and Storage Project, be the biggest project of its kind in the country. We have other projects coming on with major battery storage, and those are good for day in and day out. But if we have a sustained heat storm like we did the last few weeks, we have a major outage. We have a super cloud cover come over that we saw a couple years ago in August when we set new highs, and the weather was hot and muggy and cloudy. This battery storage is not going to cut it. And so, is there a backup so you have reliable power during that time as well? So is 100% when everything's fine? Is 100% every second of every day forever? Those are very big, big questions and very different answers to that. My job is to keep the lights on and make sure people can afford to have electricity at their house.
So that's actually a good segue, because I want to get into some more of these specific solutions being discussed. But before we do that, on this question of keeping the lights on, I mean, obviously very relevant right now. Tom, you made the point that people used to say, 20% RPS and you'll have the lights flicker. Obviously that didn't happen, but last month we we did in fact as a state have these 2 instances on these hot evenings of rotating power outages. Been a lot of sort of debate and hand-wringing over, what was the cause of this or what were the causes. Doesn't really seem like, oh, this was a, renewables problem necessarily, but definitely seems to be a, part of this transition that we're undergoing where the power system is changing. How do we have this conversation about getting to 100% renewables and, potentially speeding up the timeline at a point when probably, politically speaking and among the public, and those 2 points are related, people are going to be really concerned about keeping the lights on and about this happening again. I mean, how do we talk about this, and how do we work through that, from a planning and sort of politics perspective? And I open that up to anyone who wants to weigh in on that question.
I'm happy to. You'd like me to, Sammy?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mike?
From our perspective, I think one of the things that help in this is the bigger picture of the regional grid, what people are calling the Western grid. The more breadth you have that the grid is operating in, and I completely agree with Marty's comment about the cost curve going way up in the last 10, 20%, but I think if you spread out the supply and the way electrons can get to regions, it would really help tremendously fight some of these things. The second is obviously we have to, I'm a PG&E customer, and candidly, a lot of the trouble up north is to do with not maintaining the transmission grid properly at the levels we need to in a drought-oriented forest and landscape environment. And so I think that if we think more regionally as what the grid can provide in terms of balance. Remember, the grid's a little bit, the way I describe the transmission and even distribution grid, it's mostly AC. And that's more like a flooding a field, right? If you think of this as water as opposed to electrons, it's like flooding a field. Water will go to the lowest area and flood one area, and it'll be dry in another area because it's a different level. The more you can integrate the system to be able to move the electrons around, like moving in a field, the irrigation, the more you can manage and balance the system to be accommodating in these in challenging times. Secondly, I'm reasonably supportive of the concept of mid or micro grids, where you start designing over time grid systems that allow for, if you have a solar or wind project, to be able to supply locally in times of emergency. For example, we have a project in Puerto Rico where when the storm came through and knocked out their backbone, it basically shut the whole island down. But our wind project was available to operate as soon as the storm passed. It was a day or two later. And had we been able to turn on and have the right electrical system set up to allow us to feed the local community of St. Isabel and Ponce, we could have supplied almost everybody electricity following the outage. So I think there are ways to try to manage the grid in a localized version as well. It's a little different thinking than what we've thought about in the traditional utility systems, but I'm a big believer in both the big regional solution as well as mid and local solutions to balance in the grid.
Sammy, I can chime in on this one.
Yeah, go for it.
So I appreciate you acknowledging, and you're right, that the power challenges that we saw last month were contributable to a host of factors, and so not one in particular, but it's a good opportunity for us to look at our reliability regime and think about how do we make sure, as you said, we keep the lights on while also increasing our use of renewables and low carbon technologies. Based on our analysis, and we've modeled economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions and targets for 2045 with a particular focus on the electric sector. And we do think that you can meet the 2045 greenhouse gas reduction goals primarily with technologies that we have available to us now: renewables, storage, and some use of natural gas plants. And so as we look ahead, first of all, we have to make sure, again, that we're procuring enough resources, and we advocate for more procurement over the next several years. And we also need to take a look at our framework for providing reliability. These resources are different, renewables are different. And so our resource adequacy construct may have worked for other resources, but may need to evolve. So for example, really focusing on those critical, 2 to 4 hours a day in the evening when you have solar coming down the system, but you still have high load, making sure that we're able to meet that need and not just peak need. I think we also could warrant having a conversation about what level of reliability we want to have as a society. We've been planning, this gets to what do we plan for, right? We can plan for something different. We've been planning for a loss of load for 1 in every 10 years, but actually haven't had to experience that because we've had more margin in the system. But as we're having less resources on the grid or more variable resources, we can consider, do we want to plan for a lower loss of load, 1 in every 15 years, 1 in every 20 years? That might be a factor of we're using more electricity. If we're powering our cars, our buildings, the cost of loss of load may be higher. So I think we have to look at that. And if we plan differently, if we're planning for something else, then we're going to buy for something else, and we're procuring towards that target. But I do want to frame though that if we're going to be procuring more, planning to higher reliability targets, there is a cost impact, and I think Marty touched upon this. And we got to make sure that our power is affordable to our customers. And so, one of the things I'll highlight from our study is that we still keep about 10 gigawatts of natural gas plants on the system, running about 40% low carbon fuels. And doing that in 2045 reduces the overall cost of meeting the system needs by 40%. So you can keep a small amount of generation, gas facilities online, decarbonizing, and really have a cost impact. So those are some of the trade-offs we're going to need to be thinking about as we march our way towards that 2045 target.
A couple of things you said really caught my attention, but one in particular, the point about what happens as we electrify more parts of the economy. Obviously, this is something Edison's been pretty out front on, being favorable towards strong electrification of not only transportation but buildings. So I thought your comment that if we do that in a big way, and if we have more of our society relying on the electric grid, that we might even need to have higher reliability expectations. I thought that was really interesting, just because I think that's one of the sort of big question marks, around electrification is, people are kind of wary about, is the grid reliable right now, and do we want to power more of our society based on it? So I think that's going to be an important conversation, probably.
And Sammy, I just add, I don't think it doesn't have to be costly, right? I don't want to say that to meet that, you got to build a bunch of power plants. We saw a lot of great response from demand response during these outages. We had 1,000 megawatts of reduction in load. And so how do you utilize, if customers are using more electricity, they all don't need it at those hours, right? How do we really capture that resource? So it doesn't have to be necessarily that more expensive. It just has to be intentional. And pardon me for interrupting. I think I interrupted the commissioner.
No, that's okay.
I was actually going to say the same thing. As a few moments ago, I was all steel in the ground, but it's more than just steel in the ground. To Carla's point, we did see an excellent response from a lot of large consumers, literally voluntarily dropping their load to meet the heat storm, particularly in September. So, we need to think about better ways to harness that through our demand response programs, kind of update our demand response programs, make them more effective. And on the procurement standpoint, the procurement landscape is very different than it was 20 years ago. Back in the day, it was, us telling the 3 big IOUs, this is what you need to buy. And that world is different. We have a lot more load serving entities. We have community choice aggregators who are partially regulated by us, partially not. And all of those entities file their integrated resource plans. And this last time around, as you know, Sammy, we told them to plan to the 46 million metric ton and the 38 million metric ton, share those plans with us. But at the end of the day, those LSEs need to go out and procure those resources. And they are doing a lot of procurement. I mean, there is procurement going on. We have upwards of 15 different programs where LSEs are procuring, anywhere from the original storage mandate that Carla spearheaded when she was a commissioner at the PUC, additional storage that we have ordered in the intervening years. You know, all of that storage is not online yet. That is still in the hopper. So that'll be coming online. That will help. The additional procurement we ordered last year is going to be coming online. We still have LSEs who are doing longer term contracts to meet their RPS obligations. So there is procurement going on. We just need to keep working the problem and be creative in our solutions around things like demand response and other programs.
So I want to follow up on that point, and thank you, Commissioner Randolph, for bringing up demand response, and as well, because that's something I definitely wanted to bring into this conversation. On the question of procurement, though, and on planning, I mean, I think a criticism that I've definitely heard quite a bit over the last month. I mean, this was the sort of criticism that the independent system operator came out with after the rolling outages, is this suggestion that the PUC, you know, has not been prepared for a moment like this and has not planned adequately, you know, for a situation like the heat waves that we had over the last few weeks. And I think that with regards to the some of the storage that you were describing, this, you know, order of additional procurement that was done last year, I mean, that was sort of a little bit of a last minute thing where we were hitting these deadlines for shutting down these gas, you know, once through cooled facilities that were supposed to shut down in 2020, and it was sort of realized that that was not going to be feasible. So the commission, you know, made this sort of big procurement order and asked for the deadlines to be extended a few years. So I guess I'm hoping you can respond to this this criticism or this idea that the PUC needs to be planning for this more robustly and getting out ahead of some of these problems, potentially through ordering more procurement, but possibly in other ways.
So, you know, as you know, the three agencies are working on a root cause analysis report for trying to understand what happened in August. And so we will absolutely be completing that. I think we need to keep looking at our planning processes. As Carla mentioned, we need to look at resource adequacy and see whether we need to make changes in that area. And these are things we have been talking about for quite some time. It's important to note that the you know, renewables are much more cost effective. So when you have an abundance of resources, the old fossil fuel generators can't necessarily compete on price with the cheaper renewables, and so they may not stay around. So I think we do need to be aggressive in making sure that we have a sufficient amount of renewables to take their place. And so that is what we are working on right now.
So I just wanted to throw something in there, which, you know, we talked a lot about planning. I think we should also talk about dreaming. And this is not meant in a fascist, in a funny kind of a way. But we're entering a new era. This is the first time in the history of energy that a technology, a semiconductor technology, has entered the energy sector. This has not happened before. We have a silicon chip that is producing electricity. We have battery energy storage systems with massive amounts of semiconductors that react in milliseconds, not in minutes or hours like traditional power plants. We can completely redesign the system. We're now at a point where, you know, using Eland as an example, we're below 2 cents a kilowatt hour for solar and below 4 cents for solar plus massive storage. We're now cheaper. We're now more reliable. You know, this is like having a debate if we should extend our telephone network when we had dial-up modems. You know, nobody thinks back to those painful days anymore. There is a transition that requires a lot of infrastructure to be built. To Marty's point about, you know, transmission is important. We got to get the electrons there. I think we already have an imbalanced market. I'm not a big fan of regionalization, and here's the reason why, which is what we're doing in California is much bigger than the tons of CO2 that we are suppressing with renewables. What we're doing in California is we're showing the rest of the world and the rest of the country that you can build a clean grid. You can do this cost effectively, and you can create jobs, good paying jobs in the process, and run an economy more reliably on clean power than you can with fossil fuel. Is that a hard road ahead? Yes. But by showing that to the rest of the world, we will have a huge impact. Besides the fact that we will build a huge industry and economy out of it that we can start exporting. But a lot of the power plant designs that we're doing, the software we're developing, this is a very sophisticated technology now that we're deploying. This is not just throwing the solar panel out there in the desert and it produces electricity. These highly integrated systems, this is a new technology that California and the US can export to the rest of the world and do something really good with that. That's why I think dreaming about what we can do and what we will do, it's the same as in 1960, I forgot when it was, 1 or 2, when Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. We did not have the technology to do that when the announcement was made. So kind of planning around what is possible today limits our vision for realizing this dream. And this dream is absolutely necessary in terms of climate change. This is not, a fun thing to do. This is of strategic importance for our country and for our planet itself. So by taking a step back and thinking about what is possible, what can we do in the next 10 to 15 years, technology will evolve. You look at the solar technology from 10 years ago, it's laughable today. You look in 10 years from now, what we're doing today is going to be laughable in terms of technology and how we, give you an example. You see the panels behind me on the screen, right? Fake screen, obviously. Those panels were designed to fit on the German roof. That is the form factor of panels that we use in this power plant. We haven't even designed the panels for a highly efficient utility scale solar power plant. The batteries we're using today were made for laptops, which then Tesla and others used for cars, which we're now using for energy storage. So we're just at the very, very beginning here of this new technology revolution that is revolutionizing our entire energy sector. And what we can do with that in 10 to 15 years is going to blow all of us away. And
so
I think
I want to cut in here just for a minute. So since we're talking about technology, I think one of the biggest questions I have for you all, when you think about the technologies that are going to be needed to keep the grid balanced and to maintain reliability, how much of that do you all think can be done by building a lot more solar and wind and lithium-ion batteries, which is some of but not all of what I think Tom is talking about. How much of it is this stuff that we already have and we're good at and is pretty cheap, and how much of reliability is going to require other technologies that are either still more expensive or might not be fully baked yet? And what are some of those technologies? So I'll open that up, and whoever wants to dive in, go right. Marty, you look like you have something.
I think, we can build a zillion megawatts of solar and wind, and if we don't have a way to store it for the peak demand every afternoon and evening, it won't make any difference at all. I mean, so our numbers will go up, but we won't get there unless we can store renewable energy. And so that's really the question. I know lithium batteries are out there. They'll get better. They have a role to play for a certain number of hours on a daily basis, providing there's enough energy to recharge them, enough clean energy to recharge them every day. But that's going to be the challenge. And I think we need, we're still going to need something that what we call dispatchable power, something you can call on right now. We're going to need something that we can hold on to for a longer period of time. We do have hydropower. In LA, we have our Castaic hydro plant, which is, I think, still the second largest battery of sorts in the country. And that, we use renewable energy to pump the water back up to Lake Pyramid. And then we generate in the evening when the sun goes down. We put 1,500 megawatts, about a quarter of all our peak demand, down back into Castaic Lake. And we generate, clean hydropower to keep the lights on. And so that's a great way to do that. That's a huge amount of storage to try to replicate by some of the technology. One of the things we're looking at is hydrogen. And of course, at Intermountain Power Plant, we're going from coal to gas on our way to hydrogen. And hydrogen is a possibility of having a clean fuel, a fuel that can be generated with renewable energy and can be stored in that location, potentially enough for maybe up to a year. And then we actually could have dispatchable, clean burning power, run a power plant like a power plant, so it responds to demands. But again, if you look at all this, you're talking all these facilities that are a long way from the city. So one of the questions becomes, what do you have under your feet here in the city of Los Angeles or another city like us? If all your power is hundreds of miles away, you always have some reliability risks. And so we do need to also focus on generating power in the city and storing it in the city and in all cities, because that's a big piece of reliability. And microgrids and small scale storage will help on a day in and day out basis. But when it comes to a larger problem, a serious heat wave, some form of equipment outage or something else, and it's just like, you can't blame the last power outages and rolling blackouts on renewable energy. Renewable did exactly what it was supposed to do. But when the sun went down, the wind didn't blow, what was supposed to take its place? And that's where we need to fill the gap.
Anyone want to agree or disagree or different perspective?
I would, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is Carla, that I really welcome and appreciate and agree with Marty that it would be good to have some new resources in the mix. I mean, if we can have cost-effective hydrogen and cost-effective CCS, that'd be great to add to the toolkit. When we look at 2045, we do think that you can reach those targets with commercially available products now, primarily solar, some wind, and some battery storage. Because even if you need longer duration storage, our modeling still has us using 4-hour lithium-ion batteries in succession to get there. So I think that's a positive headline, which is technically we can get there. Now we're an opportunity to dream big, right? As Tom said, and see if there's other resources that we can bring online to enable us to do that as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think, hydrogen is an opportunity. There's other technologies, the zinc air battery technologies that, have pros and cons compared to lithium ion. Lithium ion right now, like I said, it came out of the laptops into the cars, which is why we're using it. Because there was an industry there that made them. At the time, we were too small to have our own industry making batteries for us in a cost-effective way. There's going to be more technologies. Just like, in my example, 10 years ago, we didn't think about 5G. We thought about, faster modems and whatever not, So if you told someone back then that we're going to have, a gigabit in speed over wireless, they would have laughed at you. So there's going to be a lot of technologies coming. I think what's important is to have the mindset that there is a solution out there. It's cost effective, and technology is our friend, and it can drive the cost down, and it could be clean. Let me challenge one more thing, which is I actually don't think the question of 100% is the right question. I would rephrase that and say, let's set a target for 200%. What I mean by that is we come out of a world where we had to pay for fuel, right? That's why we said I have a certain amount of load, and let me figure out how I can serve that load, right? And when I hit 100%, I'm happy, I'm done, right? With a solar power plant, at a cost, our marginal cost right now is somewhere around 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour to add more solar to an existing power plant. At that cost, which is going to be half in 5 years, at that cost, I'm just going to overbuild my solar power plant. I'm just going to serve 200% of the load. And what do I do with the excess power? Well, first of all, if there's clouds, I don't have to worry because I can still serve the load because a solar power plant, even on a cloudy day, produces. But what do I do with the excess power? I make hydrogen, right? Which Marty said I can store seasonally. I can make clean water. The only difference between dirty water and clean water is energy. So if I now have free or near free energy, I can start thinking all kinds of stuff. If you look at where Amazon and the likes are building their new data centers, guess where? In the desert. Why? Because solar power is so cheap there. That's attracting new industries, et cetera. So 100% is not the right metric, but we're going to have to over-design the system, just like your internet speed at home is way more than you actually need most of the day, right? I mean, it's pretty rare that you actually max it out, right? we're just going to have to over-design the grid. It's a completely different mindset. The fuel is free. I don't care, right? Let's burn it. Let's burn the sunshine.
I have two follow-ups
So-
here. Oh, go ahead, yeah, Commissioner Randolph. I do want to bring you in. So, yeah.
So I do think it's a very different mindset, and it's a fun engineering challenge by turning this upside down and saying, like, if I have free fuel and I have effectively free power, how do I build a system around that? We have to get away from this mindset of fossil fuel world and I have to burn stuff and pay for it, et cetera. So
let's let Commissioner Randolph, I think you want to weigh in here.
Yeah, I'll just add one of those kind of cautionary things, which is, as a former land use attorney, I could tell you that, today we are dealing with, land use battles over even renewable energy projects. And so that's one of the issues that we're talking about in the SB 100 report to the legislature that we're required to submit in January. So I think we need to be really clear-eyed. I was thinking about it as Marty was talking about pumped storage. Is there significant land use issues with pumped storage? And then there are still local land use battles over wind projects and solar projects. You still have counties that discourage the development of solar projects on former ag land. So, those are some of the kind of the big picture things we need to be thinking about in terms of trying to marshal all of the sort of, policy direction of the state towards achieving our climate goals. We have to be aware that there are these hurdles that happen time to time.
So,
Sammy,
yeah, please.
one more thing on this.
Carla, go for it. I have some follow-up, but go for it.
Isn't a nice, we're not going to let you,
You're muted now, Carla. You're muted.
See, that's what I get for us. I was like, oh, we're not going to let you get a word in, and I got muted. This is kind of a good follow-up to both the comments, which is there's also an opportunity to evolve our market rules just to better optimize the resources that we're putting in the ground now. Commissioner Randolph mentioned energy storage. And we've got about 200 megawatts of CAISO connected grid storage, but we're going to have 800 more next year once we get through the procurement that the PUC has already ordered. And we could be getting more out of our energy storage assets. And I think one of the things we tried initially was, let's just get storage on the system, but the market rules are set up for other types of resources. So there is work for us to do, probably in the more wonky, maybe less sexy space of thinking about market design and market rules. We're also doing new stuff with virtual power plants. So we've got a project with Sunrun. We're looking at how do we use the capacity of residential solar plus batteries to provide power to the grid during emergencies. So given land use constraints, given affordability concerns, we really also need to look at those opportunities as well.
Carla, on the virtual power plant, I did want to ask about that because I find that fascinating. I think what's perhaps most interesting to me about the partnership that Edison has with Sunrun that you mentioned is that traditionally the investor-owned utilities have been seen as being in this role of being, skeptical or anti, distributed resources and rooftop solar. And, I think to an extent earned, perhaps to an extent not, but I guess I am interested. Do you see, I guess, what do you see as this project, as the metric of success for Edison? I mean, what would consist of this project being a success for you? And if so, is that something that's going to incentivize you guys to be really pro rooftop solar and distributed resources if you can get something good out of it?
Well, I say getting back to just expectations around utilities related to distributed generation, we've identified a clear role for distributed solar, distributed storage in our clean energy pathway. Both Marty and Commissioner Randolph, I think all the panelists talked about some of the challenges with transmission. And so making sure we can utilize resources that are closer to load is important. And so I do think that we're moving past some of that, inherently natural tension, and as much as anything, because we're not even doing much generation anymore, right? So we're really focused on DERs and their ability to support reliability. So to your question about what do we hope to get out of this pilot, I mean, proof of concept, like can you call on these resources, just like we've been able to now rely more on some of our smart thermostat programs or other customer side programs and demand response. Is there something we can do here with the solar and storage providers? And then if it works, be able to scale it. I mean, remember, these are also systems that electric customers have been subsidizing through programs like SCHIP and net energy metering. And so we want to make sure we're getting the value of them for our overall customer base.
I want to bring Mike in here too, since I know we've, I'm sorry about the video aspect. I don't want Mike to get lost in this conversation. You know, Mike, so much of what we've been talking about here is, you know, at least so much of what I've been asking about is about scaling things up quickly and how fast can we move. I'm really interested from, you know, as your perspective, you know, running a company that's putting the steel in the ground, how quickly could you, you know, get more stuff, more, you know, wind and potentially solar, you know, with the needed transmission built relative to what you're doing now? And just, I guess I'm interested in what the financing of that looks like as well. I mean, what do you guys have the ability that you would need to, you know, move at, you know, 50% or double the speed that you're going now, and sort of what and if not, what would you need to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. Clearly, the scale up that we're talking about, let me do just a couple brief comments in. I think what we're all talking about and agreeing is there's a transition period here where you're never going to be 100% renewable by 2035 or 2045 in a reasonable way, I don't think. But there is the technology to do it, and to get you to 80%, as Marty said, fairly straightforwardly. And the question is what's the mix after going forward from there? If you look at the amount of megawatts, I mentioned that we will need about 150,000 megawatts of wind and solar to get us there. Now, maybe with storage and some other technical solutions on the transmission grid and all, we can help. I do believe the regional grid makes sense, and it reminds me of the old days in California where we swapped power from the Pacific Northwest. During the winter, we'd send up excess power because we had the capacity, and during the winter or summer, they had excess hydro capacity and they'd send them to the south. And that small illustration on a regional basis can help integrate and just give more tools to the utilities and the regulators to balance the system. But if you think of 100,000 to 150,000 megawatts, that's what, 3 times the existing system almost. So there is a tremendous amount of capital that's going to be needed. If you look at some of the support federal programs that are being proposed by the Biden campaign currently, even the ones that were introduced by McKinley and Schrader the other day, the legislation, go a long way in supporting and facilitating the type of financing that's going to be needed to get there. There's been a huge amount of ESG movement in the investor market, where if you look at even in the first 2 quarters of this year, it's multiples of the number of ESG investors in our entire history, let alone the last few years. So the capital is going to be available. There's more innovative, creative ways of structuring these transactions to make it even more financeable. But when you talk about, typically you talk about $1,000 a kilowatt, and so you can imagine the amount of dollars you're talking about to get to 100 to 150 gigawatts of new power to meet the climate needs and goals. So I would only say that there is incredible amount of capital out there looking for more deals. The capacity to supply the technology at the speed we're talking about will have to gear up. That's what I like about some of the latest proposals, both some of the Biden administration campaign proposals, as well as some of the other ones that are being proposed in Congress to support manufacturing in the United States, so we can increase our capacity locally to create more jobs as well as delivery. We'll have to scale up by 2 to 3 times our capacity to deliver in manufacturing to meet these goals. It is quite doable. I mean, the industry has done it before, and so as long as there's the manufacturing capability and the world delivery systems stay in place as they've been able to be pretty responsive to the COVID issue to get supplies disruptions moved around the world to keep them None of our projects have been seriously delayed because of supply problems, because of both domestic as well as foreign deliveries. But if you look at the hundreds of millions of billions of dollars that are going to be needed to build out this system, there is more capital out there chasing good deals than there are good deals. So there'll be capital and financing available, both debt and tax equity, but preferably tax equity will be the limiting issue in the next few years. And that's what I like about the Biden, as well as some of the other congressional proposals, is either direct pay or rebates to help facilitate the acceleration of this through the period when the economy improves and we have more taxpayers to be able to absorb some of the tax attributes of these projects.
So Mike, you've mentioned twice now regionalization, to go back to the beginning of your answer. And I promise I'm going to ask the other panelists a question about that in a minute, because I do want to get back to that. And I think it's an interesting question. But before we do that, just on, hearing, I guess for Commissioner Randolph, I think hearing Tom and Mike especially talk about, this, a much more sort of, dramatic and sort of scaled up build out of solar and wind and batteries, which to an extent, I think probably everyone, would say that's needed to some extent here. But I guess I'm interested, knowing that the Commission has obviously been very conscious and concerned, as you mentioned earlier, about costs and about what it costs to ratepayers, especially, to, as we go from, potentially 50% carbon free where we are now to 80 or 90 or 100. Solar and wind are cheap. I get that. Batteries are getting cheaper. There's still costs involved with building stuff. What do you see as, I guess, the biggest potential costs that ratepayers are going to be facing, both just on the grid in general as a result of, weather, climate conditions we're facing, and as a result of this transition to renewables to 100%? And I guess what do you see as the importance of balancing some of these potential costs on the horizon with, with moving quickly enough and perhaps faster?
Yeah. Cost is a really challenging issue because there's a lot of pressures on costs. There's the important wildfire hardening efforts that all of the utilities are undergoing, and those are costly, and the additional procurement that we are going to need over the next several years. And I think that's why it's important to be trying to spread out those costs over time to the extent possible, while still making substantial progress towards our goals. So I guess I don't have a good answer for that, other than to say it is something that we are really being mindful of. The pandemic is an example of sort of an unexpected cost hit that ratepayers are dealing with, because as more people are challenged to pay their bills, there are many more customers on the low income programs. More customers are in arrears in their payments. Usage patterns are changing. So these hits like that can affect ratepayers in unexpected and challenging ways, and we need to be mindful of that as we're setting forth our programs. And to the point Carla made, to the extent that we have various programs like NEM and SGIP, we want to make sure that we're extracting enough value from those programs to justify the cost.
This is a little bit of an abstract follow-up to that. But I guess I'm wondering if the Commission has a way of thinking about, or if you have a way of thinking about the, explicit costs, through rates of, moving much faster, even moving as fast as we're going now, versus the, the non-explicit costs and, I forget the economics term, unfortunately, someone remembers what it is, but the costs that are not included in rates, but that are still out there in the form of continuing to burn fossil fuels. I mean, I guess I asked that question because I think there's definitely a mentality of someone who would come on here and say, well, it doesn't matter how much it's going to cost. If we don't do it, it's going to be much worse no matter what.
Yeah, and that's part of the analysis that we do in the integrated resources planning proceeding. And we end up arguing back and forth quite a bit about it, about what the societal cost of carbon is,
Yep.
how to quantify that, and how to build that cost into the portfolios as we're analyzing the cost of the portfolios of resources that utilities are planning for. So it's very much part of our discussions and part of our conversation. You know, when we were having the conversation about 38 MMT versus 46 MMT versus 30 MMT, yeah. It was, yeah, I mean, the cost difference between 38 and 30 is significant. And so we are absolutely mindful of that, and we have to balance that in a way that does try to take into account the societal costs that we're also dealing with.
Thank you. And I've just got to say, I don't know how I forgot the term externality, but it came to me as you started to talk. My college economics professors would be very disappointed that that didn't come to mind.
Hey, Sammy, can I chime in on one?
Carla, go for it.
Raise, which is, you know, given her points and the issues around affordability, that's why it's so important to make sure that our modeling is as accurate as possible and that we're really reflecting the cost. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to do that. Everything from making sure that our demand forecasts are accurately accounting for weather conditions. I mean, how weather is going to look different given climate change than it used to be. Modeling how our resources will perform in high heat and things like that. And then also getting more accurate costs around some of these other technologies. I know one of the challenges for us in terms of thinking about, say, hydrogen or carbon capture and storage in our integrated modeling is there's not a lot of accurate or, you know, a lot of demonstrations of cost. And so we say something might be a viable resource, but we don't have enough experience with it or good enough cost information to really include it or compare it to, say, solar and wind. And so that's one of the things that I hope collectively we continue to work on, which is improving our modeling so that we can say to customers, hey, we've really looked at this carefully. This is what we need to do. I also want to flag and give the commissioner and the commission a shout out for the work they're doing on climate adaptation. They recently adopted a decision that requires the utilities to do climate adaptation plans and look at the impact of climate change to our infrastructure. And that's where you're going to start to be able to make some of these comparisons where you say, you know, if we don't make these investments in mitigation, what are we paying in the back end on adaptation?
So we're running a little low on time as we start to wrap up here. I promised that I was going to come back to the regionalization question. I think really I just want to pose this to Marty, and I hope everyone else forgives me for that. You know, as Mike described earlier, there's been an idea for a long time that California needs to work more, in a more coordinated way with the rest of the Western United States, perhaps through, coordinated governance or a coordinated market. And it's been a controversial idea for quite a while because of, yes, there could be benefits from, easier, smoother sharing of resources. But then it's a question of who's in control. Is California in control of its own grid? Do other states have a say in us? And I think it's really interesting for DWP because obviously you guys operate your own system. You've been, I think, skeptics of this idea for quite a while. And you had the situation last month where the rest of the state had rolling outages and you guys with your own balancing authority were fine. So I guess, Marty, what my question is here is I'm interested in how do the events of the last month, how do they or don't they shape your thinking about regionalization?
Well, not that we like to be the skeptical ones, but yes, it's interesting. We've been through all of deregulation. We remain fully vertically integrated. So we have everything from generation, transmission, distribution, and it's worked well for the city. We're relying on the investments that our customers have made over decades and decades, and that's kept the lights on in LA. And part of it's having that local control and the ability to chart our own course, make sure that we have all the reliability that we need, the resource adequacy, knowing that we can model our own situation. And you're right, the last month, not only did we supply all the city of LA, but prior to CAISO needing more power, we supplied a tremendous amount of power to Arizona, who was having a record heat storm. And then following that, we supplied energy into CAISO. At one time during the first big heat time of about 2 weeks ago. One point we supplied all of LA and 1% of the rest of the state on top of that. We, saved several other jurisdictions from having rolling blackouts, and we pride ourselves on having the resources and being reliable within ourselves. At the same time, we've been willing to share and able to share our resources. We made transmission available to CAISO during the heat storm. We're joining the energy imbalance market so that we can really fully trade on more of a real-time basis and operate more in sync with everyone else, without giving up local control and our own autonomy. So I think that that's worked well for the city. We believe it's really made a difference for us and for the folks in our balancing authority, and it's kept us reliable and able to continue to chart our own energy future, and same time participate and share with everyone around us. So it's worked well without having to be formally integrated, formally regionalized, or give up any kind of control.
I would second that. I think LADWP has done an incredible job. If you look at the facts, both on the cost side and on the reliability side, LADWP is a poster child of how to operate a grid in a cost-effective and reliable way. And we do have the energy imbalance markets, and I think the data is there. So I'm not sure why we need to reinvent the wheel there or come up with a new scheme. We can trade renewable energy already across borders. That is not a new thing. So I think keeping the autonomy and the ability to run the grid in a very efficient way, I think that's most important.
So just Mike, I think it's interesting that you and Tom, it seems, disagree on this point, perhaps. Do you think he's right or wrong on that it's working well the way we have it right now?
Well, I think there are some excellent examples of how it works well now, but it's a question of what else can be done. I think that Marty has and LADWP has done an excellent job, but some of the utilities don't have the tools and the capabilities that he has, or in state and out of state. So it's really, I don't think anybody, I shouldn't say anybody, a number of us don't feel like you have to give up complete autonomy to this. How do you run the grid on a regional basis? It's really just accelerating and increasing the amount of cooperation between regions, and there are some real limitations currently. And to think about what it means so that there's more build out of the grid that will allow sharing in a more robust way, as Marty has done in the past. And I don't think that it necessarily changes how LADWP would operate. In fact, my guess is LADWP would continue operating the way it has. But they have been a regional entity, right? I mean, you have assets in Utah. You have access to capacity and energy from various parts of the region. So in a way, you're kind of a mini version of what's being talked about.
So let's end here with a lightning round, since we've got a minute or two left. I would like each of you to shout out and maybe very briefly explain one technology or tool or planning mechanism that you think would be helpful for ramping up clean energy towards 100% while maintaining reliability that we have not already discussed in this conversation. And who wants? Should I put someone on the spot? Tom, I'm going to put you on the spot. You go first.
Oh my God. Okay. I think I already checked like all of the boxes I could think of.
You can't say solar and batteries.
Time we're thinking.
I think software. I think people talk about the smart grid, right? I don't actually exactly know what that is. But we are getting better and better and better at forecasting, at understanding exactly how our systems will be performing. To give you an idea, our battery systems, we guarantee 99% availability. A gas plant is somewhere around 80. Once you start putting all this together into what I would call a synthetic power plant, A lot of smaller customers right now are a little bit at a loss. You have co-ops all over the country. You
So
know, they
Tom-
need
Tom,
20,
I'm gonna-
30.
I'm going to have to cut you off because we're running out of time. Software is Tom's answer. Now that he's given you all a chance to think, who's next? Let's go 10, 15 seconds each here.
Well, I'll go before my idea is taken. Control charging electric vehicles.
All right, software control charging of electric vehicles. That's a good one. Who else? Liane or Marty?
I'll go.
Commissioner Randolph, yes.
I still think long duration batteries that are not lithium ion, we still need. I know we could probably go do it without it, but I am excited about some companies that are really working on that problem. I would love to see those smaller long duration storage projects.
All right, smarter long duration storage. Marty or Mike, one of you?
Yeah, I don't think Carla said, she might have said the initials earlier, but compressed air energy storage might be able to move it different places, not always out in the desert, and have something that's kind of a medium duration storage of renewable energy.
And I'll plug myself. Everyone go read the story I wrote about that and what DWP is doing in Utah with compressed air energy storage. Thank you, Marty. And Mike, close us out.
I'll go with the long term would be offshore wind, but in the short term, I'd say the technical solution we need is refundable tax credits, because that's what's going to be the limiting factor for the next few years.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for this great panel. I've enjoyed this discussion. We'll briefly shout out that I write a weekly newsletter about all of these issues and much more called Boiling Point. And if you go to latimes.com/boiling point, you can sign up for that if you'd like. It's free. It comes out every Thursday. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Sammy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joining us now